In the heart of the city, tucked away on a street forgotten by time, was an antique shop filled with the ghosts of yesterday. It was here that Alex, a young photographer with an eye for the arcane, found it. A vintage camera, its leather case cracked and its metal body coated in a fine layer of dust, sat on a cluttered shelf. He was immediately captivated by its old-world charm, the weight of its history palpable in his hands. The shopkeeper, a man whose own face seemed like a relic, named a price that was barely a whisper. Alex paid it without hesitation, unaware that he was purchasing more than just an instrument of photography. He was acquiring a key to a world unseen. Back in the quiet solitude of his apartment, Alex set up his new acquisition. He began with the simple things, capturing the empty spaces of his home. The living room bathed in the soft afternoon light. The hallway, a silent corridor of wood and plaster. When he developed the film in his makeshift darkroom, a chill crept up his spine. In the corners of the photographs where there should have been nothing but shadow, dark, blurry shapes lingered. They were faint smudges against the grain, anomalies that his eyes had not registered and his lens should not have captured. He dismissed it as a flaw in the old film or a quirk of the vintage lens, a story to tell his friends. Driven by a mix of curiosity and a growing unease, Alex loaded a fresh roll of film. He photographed the same empty rooms, but this time he focused on the corners, on the spaces where the blurs had appeared. The results were more unsettling. The shapes were clearer now, less like smudges and more like defined forms. A tall, gaunt figure began to emerge from the chemical bath, its silhouette sharp against the familiar backdrop of his home. In one photo, it lurked by the doorway. In another, it stood at the end of the hall. With each subsequent picture, the figure seemed to inch closer, its presence growing more defined, more menacing. The camera wasn't just flawed, it was seeing something that wasn't there. Or perhaps something that was. Fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced through his artistic fascination. Alex decided on one final, definitive test. He needed to prove to himself that this was a mechanical malfunction, a trick of light and antique glass. In his bedroom, he locked the door, creating a sealed, controlled environment. He set the vintage camera on a tripod, aimed it at the empty chair where he would sit, and set the self-timer. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach as the shutter clicked, the sound echoing unnaturally in the silent room. He watched, his breath held, as the Polaroid began its slow, ghostly development under the dim safety light of his darkroom. The image slowly materialized, colors bleeding into focus. His own face, tense and pale, stared back at him. And then he saw it. Standing directly behind his image in the chair was the shadowy figure, now rendered in horrifying detail. It was no longer a blur, but a distinct entity, its form skeletal and draped in shadow. Long, spindly fingers rested gently on his shoulder in the photograph. The contact, though only on paper, felt like a brand of ice on his skin. A sudden sharp creak of a floorboard sounded directly behind him in the sealed room. Every muscle in his body froze. His eyes, wide with a terror that was absolute and suffocating, slowly began to turn, drawn toward the sound, toward the presence he could now feel breathing in the darkness just over his shoulder. The world plunged into blackness. All sound ceased, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. Then a new image filled the void, seen through the distinct circular vignette of the vintage camera's lens. It showed Alex's room, now hauntingly empty. The chair he had just occupied sat vacant in the center of the frame. The only sound was the soft, deliberate click of the shutter, a lonely, mechanical heartbeat in the stillness, as the camera took one last, final picture of the empty space. The dim, dusty light of the antique shop barely illuminated the stacks of forgotten treasures. But for Alex, a young historian with a penchant for the past, it was a paradise. His fingers, tracing the spines of leather-bound books and the cold surfaces of porcelain dolls, finally landed on a small, unassuming frame. It held a Victorian-era photograph, faded and sepia-toned, depicting a stern-looking family posed for a portrait. Yet it wasn't the family that caught his eye. It was something else, something in the background. A strange, blurred figure, almost like a smudge on the lens, lurked just behind the patriarch's shoulder. A chill, unrelated to the shop's drafty interior, crept down his spine. Intrigued by the anomaly, he purchased the photograph, unaware that he was buying more than just a piece of history. The shopkeeper, a man with eyes as old as his wares, simply nodded as Alex left, a silent, knowing look passing over his face. Back in the sterile quiet of his modern apartment, the photograph seemed even more out of place. Alex placed it on his desk, the glow of his computer screen casting long shadows across the Victorian family's stoic faces. As days turned into nights, his obsession with the photo grew. He would stare at it for hours, trying to decipher the blurred shape. That's when he first noticed the change. The figure in the background was no longer just a smudge. It was becoming clearer, more defined. The vague outline had sharpened into the silhouette of a man, gaunt and tall. And worse, a faint line on its face had curled upwards into a smile. A wide, menacing grin that hadn't been there before. Soon, the strangeness bled from the photograph into his life. He'd hear faint whispers on the edge of his hearing, like a distorted recording played in reverse. Objects in his apartment would move. A book falling from a shelf, a door creaking open on its own. The air grew heavy, thick with a sense of being watched. One stormy evening, as rain lashed against his windows, the power in his apartment suddenly cut out, plunging him into absolute darkness. A profound silence filled the room, broken only by the frantic thumping of his own heart. Then he heard it, a sound from the hallway outside his apartment. A slow, dragging footstep followed by another. The sound of something heavy being pulled across the floor, getting closer and closer to his door. Panic seized him. His eyes darted around the dark room, landing on the desk where the photograph lay. Fumbling for his phone, he switched on its flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the oppressive black. He aimed the light at the photograph, his breath catching in his throat. The stern Victorian family was still there, frozen in time. But the space behind them, where the menacing figure had been lurking, was now empty. The man was gone. A sudden, splintering crash echoed from his front door. He didn't scream, he couldn't. The final scene is not of Alex, but of the photograph, now resting innocently on the desk. The sepia-toned family remains, their faces as stern as ever. But a new addition has joined their timeless portrait. In the deep background behind the matriarch's severe bun, a new shape has materialized. It is faint, blurred, and indistinct, a mere smudge in the shadows. It is the figure of a young man, his face a mask of silent, unending terror. The historian had found his place in history, trapped forever within the frame, becoming the very anomaly he sought to understand. The photograph waits patiently for its next admirer, its next victim. The dust motes danced in the lone sunbeam, slicing through the gloom of the old antique shop, a place where forgotten stories and discarded memories lay in wait. Alex, a collector of such forgotten things, ran a hand over a stack of yellowed postcards. It was then that he saw it, tucked away behind a tarnished silver locket. It was a photograph, monochrome and stark, of a man whose gaunt features and hollow eyes seemed to suck the very light from the room. The man stood beside a bare, skeletal tree, his expression one of profound, eternal despair. Something about the image resonated with a strange, dark frequency within Alex. It was unsettling, yet he couldn't look away. Against his better judgment, he bought the photograph, the shopkeeper's rheumy eyes barely registering the transaction. Back in the sterile quiet of his modern apartment, the photograph was a stark anomaly. Alex propped it on his bookshelf, the gaunt man's stare a constant, silent judgment. The first time it happened, Alex dismissed it as a trick of the light. He glanced at the photo and could have sworn the man's head was tilted slightly to the left, his gaze now fixed directly on him. He blinked, and the man was, as he had been, staring blankly forward. But the feeling of being watched lingered. Over the next few days, the unsettling occurrences escalated. The man's hand, once limp at his side, now seemed to be subtly raised as if beckoning. Shadows in his apartment, once familiar and benign, began to lengthen and writhe in his peripheral vision, twisting into grotesque, unnatural shapes. The air grew heavy and cold, and a faint whisper-like sound, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, would sometimes drift from the direction of the bookshelf. Sleep offered no escape. Alex was plagued by nightmares of barren landscapes and skeletal trees. The gaunt man always present at the edge of his dream vision, a silent, menacing observer. One night, a sudden bone-deep chill jolted him from a fitful sleep. The room was pitch black, yet the silence was different. It was a watchful, expectant silence. Alex's heart hammered against his ribs as his eyes slowly adjusted to the oppressive darkness. And then he saw it. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, was standing in the far corner of his bedroom. It was a silhouette, a void in the shape of a man, But Alex knew with a certainty that turned his blood to ice that it was the man from the photograph. The figure didn't move, it didn't breathe. It simply stood there, its presence a suffocating weight that crushed the very air from his lungs. The morning sun, usually a welcome reprieve, brought no comfort. A profound silence had fallen over the apartment, the kind that follows a terrible final event. The antique photograph still rested on the bookshelf, its monochrome world seemingly unchanged. But upon closer inspection, a horrifying alteration was revealed. The gaunt, hollow-eyed man was no longer alone. Standing beside him, captured in the same grayscale desolation, was another figure. It was Alex, his face a mask of frozen terror, his eyes wide with a despair that mirrored his new companion's. He was now a part of the collection, another forgotten story trapped forever within the silver halide prison, standing beside the skeletal tree under a sky that would never again know the sun.